born in 45 or thereabouts, now baffled by their country's whereabouts. The my dad fought for this generation, the my dad didn't fight for this generation. The baby booming generation, the first welfare state generation, the final salary pension generation, the minimum wage and women's rights generation, the swinging 60s generation, the 70s were tough generation, the 80s we saved you from the unions generation, are now the grey pound generation, the no national service generation, the dismantlers. The buy your own council house but don't build any more for the next generation, the sons and daughters of our brave boys generation, the pinkos and traitors in our midst generation, the throwing bananas on the pitch generation, the I'm not being racist but generation, the smells are different generation, the watching the empire fade away generation, the last hurrah in the South Atlantic generation, the we look after our own generation, if we can work out who we are generation, the foreign muck generation, the Viva España generation, the don't drink the water generation, the they won't let us fly our flags generation, the my generation turned into the me generation, the everybody's equal but it's gone too far generation, the don't understand rights are not a fucking pie generation, that equal rights for all doesn't mean fewer for that me generation. The quick to condemn because our dads didn't fight for this generation. The fetid nostalgia generation. The simpler times generation, the rose-tinted generation, the you could leave your door open generation. The free eye test generation, the free school milk generation, the free vaccinations generation, the free hearing aids generation, the national health specs generation, the joy of sex generation. The disappointed at the slackers generation, the dismissive of the snowflake generation, the worry about the next generation. The we had more than any other before generation, actually the only cradle to the grave generation. The lucky generation, the sons and daughters of the generation that paved the way, that did and died, became the balance the books generation, the bears and bulls generation, the market decides generation, the not my problem generation, the take responsibility while we don't generation, the you don't work for it generation, the as they reach the end times their bitterness bubbles up generation, so they clutch at straws generation, because they're not actually the fight on the beaches generation, but they can't stop looking back to those brave boys, the generation that did, that wanted a cradle to the grave for generations generation, because the 45s are not the generation that did, just the generation that didn't.